It was late on a quiet, gray Tuesday afternoon when my phone rang for the third time that day. Same unfamiliar number. No name, no contact photo, just unknown. I stared at the screen with my thumb hovering, telling myself it was probably a scam, another robotic voice promising car warranties I didn't own. But 3 calls in one afternoon didn't feel random. It felt insistent, intentional. I finally answered. Before a single word came through, I heard it. Shaky, uneven breathing on the other end. Rapid, shallow breaths that only meant one thing in my world: panic. And even without a greeting, I recognized it instantly. It was my husband. His voice came a heartbeat later, strained and high, right on the edge of hysteria. "There are trucks," he whispered, like he wasn't sure the words were real. "Big trucks, outside our house. Men, strangers, so many of them. They're loading things. They're putting all our furniture into the trucks." I leaned back in my office chair, letting it groan beneath me, and glanced up at my monitor like the time could anchor me. 2:47 p.m. Tuesday. Day 3 of silence. 3 days of him not texting me, not calling, not checking my location just to make sure I'm safe. 3 days of no passive-aggressive questions disguised as concern, no interrogations about who I ate lunch with, no demands for proof that I was where I said I was. Just space. Just quiet. Just breathing again. And now he was standing in front of my house. No, my former house, watching strangers carry our life out in neat, labeled boxes. And he sounded like the floor had dropped out from under him. "Why didn't you tell me we were moving?" he demanded, voice cracking into accusation. "Why haven't you been answering your phone?" I let the silence stretch, just long enough to turn his panic into something heavier. Then I said, calmly, almost pleasantly, "I think you've got the wrong number." The pause on the other end was sharp enough to feel like a slap. "What? No, it's me. I'm calling from someone else's phone because mine..." "You might also want to check whose house you're standing in," I added, still perfectly composed. And then I hung up. A moment later, my phone lit up again. Same number. I didn't answer. I went back to my spreadsheet like nothing had happened, except my mouth was curving into a smile I hadn't felt in months. Because the trucks weren't a mistake. They were the consequence. And this was only the beginning. My name is Linda Karishma, and I'm the kind of woman people describe as calm, when what they really mean is, she doesn't waste energy on chaos. I'm 32. I work in operations and compliance for a mid-sized firm in Washington, D.C. The kind of job where you learn to read contracts the way other people read novels, where details matter, where one careless assumption can cost you months of cleanup. I didn't always live like that. I wasn't always so measured. 7 years ago, I was softer, easier to impress, easier to guilt. I believed love was proven through endurance, through staying even when you were tired, through giving even when you weren't being held. That version of me met Ethan in a way that felt almost embarrassingly simple. A mutual friends get-together after work, on a night I almost didn't go. I remember standing by the kitchen counter with a plastic cup in my hand, watching people laugh like they had no debt, no stress, no responsibilities waiting at home. Ethan walked up and made a joke about how everyone at those gatherings pretended they weren't checking their phones every 5 minutes. I laughed, really laughed. He had this approachable confidence, not the loud kind, more like he knew who he was and didn't need to perform it. When he asked for my number, he didn't make it a game. He just did it, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. For the first year, we were good. Not perfect, no one is, but simple. We cooked together, we took long walks in neighborhoods we couldn't afford to live in yet, pointing at brownstones like they were future plans. He would rub my shoulders when I got home late, and I remember thinking, finally, someone who feels like peace. The shift was slow enough that I didn't name it at first. It started with questions that sounded innocent. Who were you laughing with on that call? Why didn't you answer right away? Who's texting you this late? And I answered. Because I had nothing to hide. because part of me thought that was what loyalty looked like, being transparent, reassuring, patient. Then the questions became routines. If I said I was going to the gym, he'd ask what time. If I came home 20 minutes later than usual, his eyes would narrow like he was doing silent math. If I smiled at something on my phone, he'd ask what was funny, but his voice wouldn't match the words. It wasn't yelling. Ethan didn't explode. That would have been easier to recognize. It was pressure. Constant, quiet pressure. And it got worse when his social circle changed. Somewhere in the last couple of years, Ethan started spending more time with a tight group, friends who spoke like they were hosting a podcast on relationships. They always had theories. They always had rules. They used phrases like power balance and emotional leverage, like love was a negotiation you won by outsmarting the other person. At first, I brushed it off. People talk, people vent, people repeat whatever they hear online. But Ethan didn't just repeat it. He absorbed it. He'd scroll on his phone at dinner, half listening to me, half typing in a group chat that seemed to matter more than what was happening in front of him. If I asked what was so funny, he'd say nothing, but his grin told me it was something. And then he started doing what they encouraged, little experiments. He'd go cold for a day and watch my reaction. He'd withhold affection like it was a lesson. He'd act distant, then claim he was just tired and wait to see if I'd chase him. Every time I tried to talk about it, he'd tilt the conversation back onto me. You're too sensitive. You overthink. Why are you making this a bigger deal than it is? And the strangest part, I still tried to fix it. Because when you've invested 7 years into something, you don't wake up one morning and decide to leave. You negotiate with yourself. You make excuses. You remember the early version of them and tell yourself that version is still in there somewhere, just buried under stress, under influence, under whatever new identity they're trying on. 5 days before those trucks showed up, we were eating dinner. Me trying to keep the conversation normal, him scrolling like I was background noise. And that's when he said it, casually, almost cute, like it was a harmless trend. They're doing a challenge, he said, eyes still on his screen. I looked up from my plate. A challenge? He finally glanced at me with that little grin I used to find charming. Delete her number for a week, he said. Don't text, don't call, just vanish. See if she even notices you're gone. I remember holding my fork midair, the room suddenly too quiet. And if she doesn't notice? I asked. He shrugged, like the answer was obvious. Then maybe she doesn't value you as much as she claims. And in that moment, something inside me went very still, because I wasn't hearing a joke. I was hearing a warning. I just didn't realize how fast he'd act on it, or how much he'd regret it when I did. I didn't argue with him that night. That's the part people always find strange when I tell this story later. How calm I was, how little I reacted. But shock doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like your body deciding to conserve energy because something important just broke. I nodded once, slowly, and went back to eating like my appetite hadn't just disappeared. Inside, though, my mind was already rearranging itself. I remembered other comments I'd brushed off over the past few months, things that hadn't made sense at the time, but now lined up too cleanly to ignore. Like the way Ethan had started narrating other people's relationships like case studies. One night he told me about a friend who'd stopped replying to her boyfriend's messages for 2 days, just to see if he'd spiral. She needed to know she mattered, Ethan said, admiration softening his voice. And guess what? He showed up at her place with flowers. Another time, he laughed about someone else withholding affection as a reset. It's healthy, he insisted. You can't always be available. People need to earn access to you. Each story had landed wrong, like a note out of tune, but I'd told myself I was overthinking it. Now I saw the pattern. These weren't conversations. They were rehearsals. And the more I replayed that dinner in my head, the more I realized he hadn't been sharing information. He'd been informing me, testing the waters, watching my reaction, measuring how much discomfort I'd tolerate before pushing back. I hadn't given him anything that night. No approval, no outrage, just a quiet nod. And to him, silence didn't mean refusal. It meant permission. The next morning, I woke up to nothing. No good morning text, no sarcastic meme, no location ping disguised as concern. At first, I felt a flicker of confusion. I checked my phone out of habit while brushing my teeth, half expecting to see his name lighting up the screen. Nothing. At lunch, I checked again. Still nothing. I told myself he was busy, or distracted, or maybe just testing out his little theory for a few hours. By dinner, the quiet felt heavier. I ate alone at the table we usually shared, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, noticing how loud the apartment sounded without his commentary filling the space. My phone sat face up beside my plate like a silent witness. Still nothing. That night, I slept deeper than I had in months. No tense energy in the room. No feeling of being watched. No late-night questions about what I'd been thinking before I fell asleep. The second day was clearer. Not easier, just sharper. I realized how often I'd adjusted my behavior around his expectations. How often I'd softened my tone, shortened my explanations, or preemptively justified things he hadn't even questioned yet. I went to work, I went to the gym, I showered, I cooked, I existed, and no one demanded proof. That's when the thought crept in, quiet, unsettling. What if this isn't an accident? On the third day, the memory of that dinner hit me with full clarity. They're doing a challenge. The way he'd said it, casual, confident, almost proud. This wasn't absence, it was strategy. And suddenly, the silence stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling calculated. He wasn't busy. He wasn't distracted. He was waiting. Waiting to see if I'd panic. Waiting to see if I'd chase. Waiting to see if I'd break. And the realization did something unexpected. It didn't make me angry. It made me precise. That night, after I finished cleaning the kitchen, after the apartment settled into its usual quiet, I sat on the edge of the couch and stared at my phone for a long moment. Then I made 3 calls. The first was to my real estate attorney, the same one who'd handled the purchase of the house 3 years before Ethan and I ever got married. The second was to a moving company I'd researched months earlier but never hired because I'd convinced myself leaving would be dramatic. The third was to a storage facility not far from Rockville Pike. Each call was calm, efficient, professional. No raised voices. No ultimatums, just logistics. Because while Ethan thought he was testing whether I'd noticed his absence, he'd missed something critical. I wasn't failing his test. I was opting out of the game entirely. And by the time the third day ended, everything that mattered was already in motion. The trucks arrived exactly when they were supposed to. Tuesday afternoon. Gray sky. The kind of dull, colorless day that makes everything feel suspended, like the world itself is holding its breath. I was at my desk when the first call came in. Unknown number. I ignored it. The second call followed 20 minutes later. Ignored again. By the third time, something in me shifted. Not urgency, not fear, but awareness. The calm kind that comes when you already know the answer and are simply waiting for the question to catch up. That's when I answered. The sound of Ethan's breathing hit me before his words did. Fast, uneven, like he'd run a mile without stopping. I pictured him standing on the sidewalk, keys in his hand, staring at the open front door of the house he thought we owned together. There are trucks, he said, outside, big ones. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the time, 2:47 p.m. Right on schedule. They're loading our furniture, he continued, voice rising. Men I don't recognize. Why didn't you tell me we were moving? I didn't rush to answer. Silence has weight when you let it sit long enough. Why haven't you been answering your phone? He demanded. 3 days ago, he deleted my number on purpose. Now he wanted access again. I let that irony breathe before I spoke. I think you have the wrong number. The line went so quiet, I could almost hear his confusion rearranging itself. What? No, Linda, it's me. I'm calling from someone else's phone because mine is... You should also check whose house you're standing in, I said calmly. I ended the call before he could respond. My phone lit up again immediately. Same number. I declined it and returned to my spreadsheet. Adjusting a column like this was any other afternoon. Only this time, I was smiling. 3 days of silence. No surveillance disguised as affection. No interrogations. No location checks masked as concern. I hadn't realized how tight the leash had become until I felt it fall away. The phone rang again. I let it go to voicemail. When it rang the fourth time, I answered. What property owner? Ethan's voice was frantic now. The movers won't talk to me. They said to contact the property owner. Is this a joke? Are you punishing me? The neighbors are watching. How do I make them stop? Sorry, I replied politely. Who is this? Stop it, he snapped. This isn't funny. If you're looking for the previous tenant, I continued evenly, they moved out. The lease wasn't renewed. I suggest contacting your landlord for forwarding information. And then I hung up again. The truth, my favorite part of all this, was that Ethan had never asked about the house. Not once. He'd never asked whose name was on the deed. Never wondered why the property tax bills came addressed only to me. Never questioned why the mortgage payments left my account. He'd assumed. Marriage to him meant automatic ownership, automatic access, automatic entitlement. But assumptions collapse when exposed to paperwork. I bought that house 3 years before we got married. I saved every bonus, worked overtime, cut back when others spent freely. I didn't do it to hold power. I did it because security mattered to me. And now it mattered again. The eviction notice had been filed on day 1 of his challenge. 30 days notice, fully legal, documented, clean. While Ethan was laughing in a group chat about whether I'd noticed his absence, I was signing documents in my attorney's office. Another call came through. This time, it wasn't Ethan. It was one of his friends, the loud one. The one who always spoke like she was leading a movement. You can't do this, she snapped. This is illegal. We have rights. Actually, I said calmly, everything I've done is entirely legal. I own the house solely. I initiated proper eviction proceedings with the required notice. It's all documented. Silence. You're just mad he has friends who empower him, she finally said. I almost laughed. Tell me, I replied, does empowerment usually involve making someone homeless? Or is that a new feature? The call ended shortly after that. And then, finally, Ethan called again. His voice different now. Not angry. Broken. They showed me the group chat, he said. Everything you were saying about me. About this. I listened. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control the narrative. He was watching it collapse. And in that moment, as the trucks finished loading the last of the furniture, I understood something clearly. The moving day wasn't the incident. It was the revelation. This was the exact point where the game he thought he was playing ended, and reality took over. I didn't interrupt him while he talked. That surprised him. Ethan had always expected reactions. Tears, anger, explanations, reassurance. Silence made him uneasy. It always had. Silence meant he couldn't steer the moment. They showed me the messages, he said again, voice cracking. The group chat. I didn't realize how bad it sounded until I read it all together. I stood up from my desk and walked toward the window, phone pressed lightly to my ear. Below me, the city moved on, people crossing streets, buses stopping and starting, lives unfolding without manufactured crises. Read it out loud to yourself, I said quietly. Not to me. To yourself. He swallowed. I could hear it. They said you'd panic, he continued, rushing now. They promised me you'd blow up my phone, that you'd be scared, that you'd finally understand my value. There it was. Not love, not connection. Value measured by fear. And when that didn't happen, I asked. Silence stretched, heavy, honest. They told me not to crack, he whispered. They said I was winning, that you were probably spiraling, trying to figure out what you'd done wrong. I closed my eyes. While they were fantasizing about my breakdown, I had been sleeping better than I had in months. That's why you're upset, I said, not unkindly. Not because you hurt me, because the script didn't work. That's not true, he protested. I didn't want this to go this far. But you let it, I replied. Every day. Every message you sent to them instead of me. His breathing turned uneven again, but this time it wasn't panic. It was grief, real grief. The kind that comes when you realize you've misjudged the ground beneath your feet. I was insecure, he said. I felt like you were pulling away. I turned from the window and leaned against the desk. Did you ever say that to me? I asked. Not hint, not test, not punish. Did you ever sit down and say, I feel insecure in our marriage? No, he admitted. Did you ask how I was feeling? Another pause. No. Then what you wanted wasn't reassurance, I said. It was control. The word landed hard. I could hear it in the way his breath hitched. That's not how they framed it, he said weakly. I know, I replied. Manipulation never is. He started crying then. Not loudly, not theatrically. Just quiet, broken sounds he probably didn't even realize he was making. I thought if you chased me, he said, it would mean you still cared. And I thought, I answered, that if you disappeared without a word, it meant you didn't respect me enough to talk. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he asked the question I'd known was coming. So that's it? 7 years over because of a stupid challenge? I exhaled slowly. No, I said. 7 years ended because when given the choice between communication and games, you chose games. The challenge was just how you showed me. But I'm here now, he pleaded. I'm calling. I want to fix this. I'll tell them it's over. I'll cut them off. That's the problem, I said gently. You think this ends when you tell someone else to stop. It doesn't? No. It ends when you understand why it should never have started. He was quiet again. I didn't think you'd go this far, he finally said. I smiled, not with joy, but with clarity. And I didn't think I'd stay quiet this long. We're both learning. Another call buzzed through, this time from one of his friends. Apologetic, nervous. Please, she said quickly, just talk to him. This is blowing up. Partners are finding out about the advice. People are leaving. We didn't mean for it to... I know, I cut in calmly. You meant for it to work. The call ended shortly after. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was smaller. Why aren't you scared of losing me? I looked out the window one last time before answering. Because you already chose to leave, I said. You just expected me to chase you when you did. I ended the call then, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to explain. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to him. I was responding to myself. And somewhere in that stillness, I realized something crucial. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about winning. It was about no longer accepting love that needed fear to function. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. The silence after that call didn't last. It never does when control slips through someone's fingers. By the next morning, my phone was a carousel of unfamiliar numbers, missed calls, voicemails, texts that started polite and escalated into accusation, then panic, then bargaining. Ethan's friends had shifted strategies. First came reason. Can you please just hear him out? 7 years is a long time to throw away over a misunderstanding. You're being too harsh. Then came blame. You're punishing him. You're humiliating him in front of the neighbors. This feels vindictive. And finally, fear. This is getting bigger than you think. People are asking questions. Other relationships are blowing up because of this. That last part told me everything. The problem wasn't that Ethan had been hurt. The problem was that the system had been exposed. I answered one call mid-morning while waiting for coffee to finish brewing. Linda, a woman said quickly, breathless. This has gone too far. You've made your point. My point? I asked calmly. Yes, you scared him. He understands now. That's interesting, I replied, because fear was never supposed to be the lesson. She hesitated. Then what was? That love doesn't survive, Tess, I said. It survives honesty, and he skipped that part. She tried another angle. He felt ignored, unseen. Doesn't that matter? It does, I agreed. But ignoring your partner and calling it a challenge isn't how you ask to be seen. The line went quiet. By noon, the narrative shifted again. Now it was about me. I was cold, calculated, emotionally detached, as if composure were a crime, as if a woman choosing clarity over chaos needed a diagnosis. Ethan called again that afternoon. This time he wasn't crying. He was angry. They're saying you planned this, he snapped, that you were just waiting for an excuse to leave. I laughed softly, Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. That's easier than admitting you handed me the reason, I said. You talked to a lawyer on day one, he accused. You lined up movers, storage. You didn't even give us a chance. I gave us 7 years, I replied, and 3 days of silence to see if you'd come back on your own. I didn't know you were waiting, he said. Of course you didn't, I answered. You were too busy checking in with your friends about whether I was panicking yet. He went quiet. So what happens now? He asked finally. Now, I said. Now the consequences finish unfolding. That's when the cracks in his circle really started to show. One by one, partners of the friend group began discovering the messages. Screenshots passed hands. Conversations they'd never known existed came into the light. Advice threads about withholding affection, about creating jealousy, about training partners through emotional scarcity. One woman called me sobbing. I didn't know he was listening to them, she said. I thought it was just venting. He moved out last night. Another texted, my boyfriend found the chat. He asked me if I've ever tried to manipulate him. I didn't know how to answer. The group that once felt powerful now felt dangerous. And when people feel exposed, they look for someone to blame. That someone became me. Ethan showed up outside my office building one evening without warning. I saw him through the glass doors before he saw me. Shoulders slumped, jaw tight, anger and desperation fighting for dominance. I didn't let him in. We stood on opposite sides of the glass, like a metaphor neither of us commented on. You didn't have to do this publicly, he said. I didn't, I replied. You did, when you turned our marriage into content for your group chat. He flinched. I didn't think you'd leave, he admitted. I thought, worst case, you'd be mad. We'd fight, then we'd make up. That's the risk you take when you gamble with someone else's trust, I said. Sometimes you lose. Everyone's mad at me, he said bitterly. They say I misrepresented things, that I took it too far. I tilted my head slightly. And what do you think? He hesitated. That pause told me more than any apology could have. I don't know, he finally said. And that was the problem. Not that he'd made a mistake, but that he still couldn't see it clearly. The escalation wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no screaming matches or flying accusations. It was worse than that. It was quiet reputations collapsing, friendships straining, partners reevaluating the stories they'd been told. And in the middle of it all, Ethan was learning something he'd never expected. When you build intimacy on control, it doesn't collapse gracefully. It implodes. I stopped answering calls after that. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because the conversations were no longer productive. There was nothing left to debate. The paperwork was moving forward. The timeline was set. The future was no longer negotiable. And for the first time since I'd married him, I wasn't managing his emotions. I was protecting my own. The quiet returned again, but this time, it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. The kind of quiet that settles in your chest late at night when there's nothing left to distract you from the reality of what you've set in motion. The movers were gone. The calls had slowed. The adrenaline that had carried me through decisions and logistics finally burned off, and what remained was grief. Not regret, but grief. I lay awake in my temporary apartment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a building that wasn't mine yet, the hum of traffic outside, the footsteps of strangers above me. No familiar creaks in the floor, no shared routines. No history in the walls. 7 years doesn't disappear just because you make the right decision. It lingers. I found myself remembering small, inconvenient moments, the kind that sneak up on you when you least expect them. The way Ethan used to bring me tea when I worked late. How he'd squeeze my hand twice when we crossed the street. The inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else. Those memories didn't mean I'd imagined the manipulation. They meant the loss was real, and acknowledging that hurt more than anger ever could. There was one night, around day 10, when the doubt crept in hardest. I'd just finished unpacking the last box I'd brought with me. Clothes folded, books on shelves, my life reduced to what fit in a few containers. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and asked myself the question, everyone else had been asking me since this started. Was I too extreme? Ending a marriage over silence, over a challenge, over something that hadn't involved cheating or screaming or violence. Just control. Just manipulation. Just erosion. I opened my phone and scrolled through old photos, not because I wanted him back, but because part of me needed proof that what we'd had was real, that I hadn't exaggerated it all into something bigger than it was. And that's when I saw it. Not a single photo of us from the last year where I wasn't subtly braced. My shoulders always slightly raised, my smile careful. My body angled away even when I was next to him. I hadn't felt safe, not physically, emotionally. I'd been performing calm while constantly being evaluated, and that realization hit harder than any accusation ever could. Still, the doubt didn't vanish overnight. It never. Ethan texted me once during that period. Just one line. "I don't recognize you anymore." I stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone down without replying, because the truth was, I didn't recognize myself either. Not the woman who used to explain herself into exhaustion. Not the woman who accepted "that's just how I am" as an excuse. Not the woman who mistook emotional surveillance for care. This version of me was quieter, firmer, less apologetic, and change, even healthy change, can feel like loss. That was my lowest point. Not the confrontation, not the movers, not the backlash, but the night I realized that choosing myself meant letting go of a version of my life I'd once believed would last forever. There was no dramatic breakdown, no screaming into pillows, just a slow, aching acceptance. I cried alone, silently, the kind of crying that doesn't need witnesses, the kind that cleans something out of you rather than breaking you open. And somewhere in that darkness, another truth surfaced, steady and undeniable. If I went back now, it wouldn't be because I believed in us. It would be because I was afraid of being alone, and fear had already ruled that marriage long enough. I fell asleep that night with swollen eyes and a calm I hadn't felt before. Not peace yet, but resolve. The kind that forms when you stop asking if you did the right thing and start asking what kind of life you're willing to accept. The next morning, something shifted, not outwardly, but internally, and that shift would change everything. The shift didn't come with clarity right away. It came with information. I was making coffee the next morning when an email notification slid across my screen. An unfamiliar name, no subject line, just a single attachment and one sentence in the body. "I think you deserve to see this. I'm sorry it took me so long." The sender was Mark, one of the men loosely connected to Ethan's friend group. I'd met him maybe twice at larger gatherings. Quiet, observant, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. I hesitated before opening the attachment. Then I did. It was a folder of screenshots, time-stamped, organized, undeniable. The full group chat, not excerpts, not selective polls, everything. I scrolled slowly, my coffee forgotten on the counter, growing cold as the words rearranged my understanding. Not of what happened, but of how deliberate it had been. They weren't venting. They were strategizing. Charts, actual lists about effective withdrawal tactics. Messages ranking whose partner broke fastest. Celebratory emojis when someone reported their boyfriend apologizing for things he hadn't done. And then I saw myself. My name wasn't used, but I was unmistakable. She's too independent. She doesn't chase. Delete her number, that'll do it. Silence always works. Men hate it. She'll come back scared. They always do. I didn't feel shocked. I felt confirmed. There was a strange peace in seeing the truth written so plainly. No more wondering if I'd misread tone. No more questioning my instincts. No more room for self-doubt to hide. At the bottom of the folder was one final screenshot. Ethan, 3 days into his silence, writing, "Still nothing. She hasn't tried to reach me." And a response immediately below it. "Good, that means it's working. Don't crack now." I sat down at the kitchen table and closed my eyes. This wasn't insecurity. This was intention. Later that afternoon, Mark called me. I didn't participate, he said quickly, but I didn't stop it either, and that makes me complicit. Why send this now? I asked. Because my girlfriend found it, he replied, and she asked me one question I couldn't answer. If you knew this was wrong, why didn't you say anything? I thanked him and ended the call. I didn't need more explanations. What I needed was acceptance. Not from Ethan, not from his friends, not from anyone who had watched this unfold and chosen comfort over integrity. I accepted that the woman I married had been replaced, not by someone else, but by an idea that power was safer than vulnerability, that control was easier than communication, that winning mattered more than connecting. That realization did something profound. It removed the last trace of guilt. That evening, Ethan called again. I answered. I saw the chat, I said before he could speak. Silence. All of it, I continued. Not the version you summarized. Not the parts that made you look confused instead of complicit. His breath caught. I didn't think they'd keep it, he whispered. I know, I said calmly. You didn't think about me at all. I was insecure, he repeated, like a shield he hoped would still work. Insecurity explains feelings, I replied. It doesn't justify behavior. There was nothing left for him to say. And for the first time since this started, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was stepping toward something, myself. That night, I emailed my attorney and told her to proceed without delay. No more waiting. No more grace periods. No more emotional negotiations. I wasn't angry. I was resolved. Because the turning point wasn't the screenshots. It was the moment I realized that I didn't need him to understand why this was wrong. I needed to understand why I would never accept it again. And I did. Completely. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They ripple outward, quietly at first, touching everything the person thought was stable, dependable, permanent. Within a week, Ethan's world began to shrink. Not dramatically, not in the cinematic way people expect when a marriage ends, but steadily. Friends stopped returning his calls, not out of loyalty to me, but out of self-preservation. No one wanted to be the next person whose private messages were exposed, whose advice was screenshot, whose words were suddenly accountable. The same people who had cheered him on during the challenge now distanced themselves from it, from him. I heard about it indirectly. I didn't ask. One friend's boyfriend moved out after finding messages about training men through silence. Another relationship entered emergency counseling when old advice threads surfaced. Two couples quietly separated without public explanations. The group that once thrived on shared validation fractured under shared responsibility. And Ethan, who had believed he was acting with collective wisdom, found himself standing alone. He called me once more after that, not crying, not angry, deflated. They won't answer me, he said flatly. The people who told me this was smart, healthy, empowering. I listened without interruption. They say they never meant it to go this far, he continued, that I took it too seriously. I closed my eyes. That's what people say, I replied, when they don't want to own the damage they helped cause. My parents are asking questions, he added quietly. They want to know why you moved out so suddenly. There it was. The shift from private failure to public accountability. You can tell them the truth, I said, or you can tell them a version that protects you. Either way, I won't correct it. He exhaled sharply. I didn't think it would cost me this much. That's because you thought the cost would be paid by me, I answered. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. The legal side moved forward without drama. The prenup did exactly what it was designed to do. Separate cleanly, without spectacle, without leverage, without prolonged dependency. The house remained mine. The timelines were clear, the boundaries firm. I didn't celebrate any of it. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was calm, a deep, grounded calm that came from watching reality align with truth instead of fantasy. The last time I saw Ethan was brief. We crossed paths outside a coffee shop near Woodley Park. Pure coincidence. He looked thinner. tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. We exchanged polite nods, nothing more. No confrontation, no final speeches, just recognition, and then separation. That to me was the most telling consequence of all. Not that he lost friends, not that his reputation took a hit, not even that his marriage ended, but that the power he thought he'd been gaining evaporated the moment he no longer had someone reacting to him. Control only works when someone participates. I had stopped. And once I did, everything he built around that control collapsed under its own weight. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need public vindication. The truth did what it always does when left alone long enough. It came back to the source. Weeks later, I was sitting in my new apartment in Columbia Heights, watching late afternoon light slide across the hardwood floor. The space was smaller than the house, but it was quieter in all the ways that mattered. No tension humming in the air. No phone lighting up with demands disguised as concern. No sense that I was being observed, evaluated, or tested. Just me. Work settled into and even started dating again. Not seriously, not with expectations, just conversations, just curiosity, just learning what it felt like to be with someone without wondering when the next test would come. Through the grapevine, I heard about Ethan. He was staying with family for a while. The friend group had splintered completely. Some people apologizing to their partners, others doubling down and claiming they were misunderstood. A few relationships ended. A few limped into therapy. Ethan drifted between blaming me and slowly, painfully recognizing his role. I didn't monitor it. It wasn't my work anymore. People asked me if I regretted it, ending a 7-year marriage over what sounded, on the surface, like a phone challenge. They never understood. It was never about the phone. It was about a man who looked at our marriage and thought, what can I take away to see if she notices? Instead of asking, what can I add to make this stronger? The silence wasn't the betrayal. The intention was. Healthy love doesn't need fear to function. It doesn't require disappearance to prove value. It doesn't test devotion by manufacturing anxiety. Secure people don't play games. They talk, they listen, they choose connection, even when it's uncomfortable. I didn't leave because he ignored me for 3 days. I left because those 3 days revealed the truth of the 7 years before them. And once you see that clearly, staying becomes the real mistake. Some relationships end in screaming matches and slammed doors. Mine ended in silence, one moving truck, and a realization that the healthiest thing you can do is stop proving your worth to someone who only recognizes it when they're afraid to lose you. Wrong number, wrong house, wrong relationship, but the right decision.